My mother-in-law announced she was keeping my baby because 3 months of caregiving made her the real grandmother. When I finally stood upright in my mother-in-law's foyer, still weak enough that the floor tilted under me, she looked at the baby in her arms and told me I could visit on weekends if I behaved myself. I laughed at first. The way you laugh at something so absurd your body doesn't know how else to process it. Because 3 days earlier I had been strong enough to sign my own hospital discharge papers and I still couldn't fully believe someone was standing in a doorway, deciding whether I got to hold my own daughter. Corinne Merrick did not laugh back. She adjusted the baby against her shoulder, patted her tiny back with the practiced rhythm of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and told me, in the calm voice of a woman who had already rehearsed every word, that Iris needed stability more than she needed a mother who might collapse again without warning. I had been married to Nathaniel Merrick for 4 years, and pregnant with our daughter Iris for what should have been an unremarkable 39 weeks, when my blood pressure spiked without warning during labor, and turned an ordinary delivery into a nightmare no one had prepared me for. I remember the room filling with more people than seemed necessary. Remember a doctor's voice going tight and clipped. Remember Nathaniel's face going the color of paper right before everything went dark. What I've been told since is that I suffered a severe eclamptic seizure minutes after Iris was born, followed by a hemorrhagic stroke that left my brain swollen enough that doctors put me into a medically induced coma to keep me alive, an unconscious state they expected to last a week, maybe 2, and that instead stretched into 3 full months. My mother-in-law Corinne was a retired labor and delivery nurse with 26 years at the same hospital where I'd just given birth, and in the earliest days of my coma, that credential made her the most trusted person in the room. Nurses who'd once worked alongside her greeted her by first name in the hallway. Doctors updated her before they updated Nathaniel, assuming, reasonably enough, that a woman who understood medical terminology would grasp the situation faster than a grieving husband barely holding himself together. I trusted her completely before any of this happened, the way you trust a mother-in-law who shows up early to every holiday and remembers your coffee order without being told. I had no idea, lying unconscious in that hospital bed, that trust was about to become the exact tool she'd use to take my daughter. The early red flag, the one Nathaniel later admitted he'd noticed and dismissed, came 4 days into my coma, when Corinne asked the hospital's pediatric staff to list her as Iris's primary emergency contact instead of Nathaniel, explaining that as a retired nurse, she could respond faster to any medical concerns than a father who'd never changed a diaper before that week. The nurse manager, an old colleague of Corinne's, approved it without much scrutiny, and Nathaniel signed off on the paperwork exhausted and grateful for anyone willing to take something off his plate. He told himself it was practical, that his mother genuinely knew more about newborn care than he did, that questioning her intentions during the worst week of both their lives would have felt cruel and paranoid in equal measure. 2 weeks into my coma, Corinne moved into our house without asking, arriving with 2 suitcases and a portable crib she said she'd bought just in case, setting herself up in our guest room like a woman settling into a long-term assignment rather than a temporary favor. She took over Iris's feeding schedule, her pediatrician appointments, her middle-of-the-night crying, functions Nathaniel was too shattered with grief and hospital visits to fully manage himself. I don't blame him for needing the help. I do blame myself, in the quiet moments since, for never once imagining that the help would come with an invoice nobody had told me I'd owe. The rationalization started early and never really stopped. Nathaniel told himself his mother was simply doing what any devoted grandmother would do during an unthinkable crisis, that her competence was a gift rather than a warning sign, that the alternative, a stranger nanny or a chaotic string of favors from friends, would have been far worse for a newborn who'd already lost access to her mother through no fault of anyone's. He didn't notice, or didn't let himself notice, that Corinne had started introducing Iris to the mail carrier and the next-door neighbors as my baby instead of my granddaughter, a slip he later described as something that had felt too small to mention at the time, the kind of harmless verbal shorthand exhausted people use without meaning anything by it. 6 weeks into my coma, Corinne opened an Instagram account under the name Grandma Corey Raises Baby Iris, posting daily photos and videos with captions describing herself as Iris's primary caregiver while mommy recovers, language that read, on its surface, like an honest and even generous acknowledgement of a hard situation. Nathaniel found the account and felt a flicker of unease he couldn't fully articulate, something about the volume of it, nearly 4,000 followers within a month, strangers commenting things like, she's so lucky to have you as her real mom right now, that Corinne never once corrected in the replies. He mentioned it to her once, gently, and she told him people needed hope during scary times, that the account was helping her cope with the fear of nearly losing another grandchild the way she'd nearly lost her first one, and he let the explanation close the conversation before it could go any further. That explanation referenced something Nathaniel had grown up hearing about only in fragments. His older brother, Rowan Merrick, had a son named Miles from his first marriage, and Rowan's ex-wife, Adeline, had cut off Corinne's contact with Miles almost entirely 6 years earlier after what Adeline described. In a single furious phone call Nathaniel had overheard as a teenager, as Corinne, acting like she owned that baby instead of just loving him. At the time, the family had absorbed it as an unfortunate casualty of a messy divorce, Adeline's understandable bitterness rather than anything reflecting badly on Corinne. Nobody in the family had ever gone back and asked Adeline directly what she'd meant by those words, a gap in the story that would matter enormously once investigators finally did. 8 weeks into my coma, a nurse practitioner reviewing Iris's chart at a routine well baby visit noticed that the intake form listed Corinne Merrick under the field marked Mother, a detail Corinne explained away as a clerical error made by a rushed front desk employee. An explanation the practice accepted without escalating it further, because Corinne's own former colleagues still worked 2 floors up and vouched for her without hesitation. Nathaniel wasn't in the room for that appointment, working overtime to cover the mounting medical bills, and didn't learn about the chart error until much later. Buried inside a stack of records his lawyer would eventually pull 1 page at a time. 10 weeks into my coma, doctors began slowly reducing my sedation, and I surfaced in fragments over several days, disoriented and terrified, unable at first to remember I'd even given birth. When the memory finally arrived, whole and devastating, in the middle of a Thursday afternoon, the first thing I said, according to the nurse charting my vitals, was my daughter's name, spoken as a question rather than a statement. Like some part of me already suspected the answer wouldn't be simple. Nathaniel told me Iris was safe, that his mother had her, that everyone had been so grateful Corinne stepped in during such a terrifying stretch, and I was too weak and too disoriented to hear anything strange in how carefully he chose those words. It took me 4 more days in that hospital bed before I was strong enough to hold a phone steady, and when I finally called Corinne to tell her I was awake and wanted to see my daughter, she didn't answer. She texted back an hour later saying Iris had just started sleeping through the night for the first time, and it would be unkind to disrupt a routine that fragile, promising she'd bring her by soon. I told myself she was being careful, protective, exactly the kind of grandmother who thinks these things through. Soon kept not arriving. The next day Iris supposedly had a mild cold. The day after, a pediatrician appointment ran long. Each excuse sounded reasonable in isolation, and stacked together they built a wall I didn't recognize as a wall until I was standing directly against it. I was discharged 9 days later, still weak enough that Nathaniel had to support most of my weight walking to the car, still on medication to manage the risk of another seizure, still relearning how to climb a single flight of stairs without stopping to catch my breath. The excuses from Corinne continued for 5 more days after that, until I finally told Nathaniel I couldn't wait any longer, that I needed to see my daughter today, and he drove me to his mother's house with an expression I now recognize as a man who already suspected what was waiting for us, but hadn't found the courage to say it out loud. Corinne opened her front door and stood in the gap the way a woman defends a doorway she's already decided not to give up. One hand braced against the frame, her body angled just enough to block any real view inside. She wasn't surprised to see me. She'd clearly rehearsed this moment the same way she'd rehearsed everything else over the previous 3 months. "She's finally adjusted," Corinne said before I could get a single word out, her voice calm and reasonable in a way that made me feel, for one disorienting second, like the unstable one. "She has a routine. She knows my voice. She sleeps through the night now because I stayed up with her every single hour you couldn't." My hands started shaking against the doorframe, my body remembering fear faster than my mind could process what was actually happening. I told her Iris was my daughter and I was taking her home, and Corinne's expression didn't change at all, like she'd expected exactly this line and had an answer already loaded. "I've cared for this baby every single day for 3 months while you were unconscious," she said. "I fed her. I rocked her through every fever. I know her cries better than her own mother does at this point. Ripping her away from the only stability she's ever known, just because you woke up and feel entitled to her again, would be an act of pure selfishness, and I won't let you damage my granddaughter to soothe your own guilt." My granddaughter, she said it like a legal claim rather than a relationship, and something in my chest went cold and hard at the same time. Nathaniel stepped up beside me then, his voice thin, saying maybe we should all sit down and talk this through calmly, that Iris had been through so much change already, and a sudden transition might not be good for her. I turned and looked at my husband, this man who was supposed to be standing beside me without hesitation, and understood in that single moment that he had already spent 3 months slowly absorbing his mother's version of events, that some part of him had started believing her competence made her claim legitimate. I told him this wasn't a debate. that I was her mother and I was taking her home today. And Corinne reached behind the door and produced a folder, thick with paper, already in her hand with the readiness of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this cue. "I've documented everything," she said, holding the folder out like a winning card in a game only she'd known she was playing. 90 days of full-time care, every pediatrician visit, a sleep log, a feeding log, emergency contact designation from the hospital itself. Any judge in this state would look at this folder, then look at you, a woman who nearly died and could seize again without warning, and they would have no trouble at all deciding who the real caregiver is. She said it flatly, without flinching, and I stood on her porch with my chest still healing from a stroke I hadn't chosen, and I did the only thing left to do. I called the police. The officer who arrived was a tired-looking man named Officer Bracken, and his posture told me he'd expected a routine noise complaint or a minor family dispute, something small enough to resolve with a stern word and a handshake. Then he heard the phrase, "Won't give me back my baby," and his entire demeanor sharpened into something focused and careful. "Ma'am," he said to Corinne, "am I understanding correctly that you are refusing to return this infant to her legal mother?" Corinne drew herself up to her full height and rearranged her face into the version of herself she wanted the officer to see, composed, reasonable, the picture of a devoted grandmother wronged by circumstance rather than a woman standing in the middle of a theft. "She was medically incapacitated for 3 months with no guarantee of recovery," Corinne said. "I stepped selflessly into that gap to keep an infant alive and thriving. That constitutes an emergency guardianship arrangement, and I have documentation to prove it." She pulled a single page from the folder and held it toward Officer Bracken, and I got there first, my hands shaking as I looked down at a form headed Temporary Medical and Custodial Authorization, a signature at the bottom that was supposed to be mine, dated to a day I had spent entirely unconscious in an intensive care unit with a ventilator doing my breathing for me. She had forged my name. She had dated the forgery to a day she knew, better than almost anyone alive, that I could not possibly have signed anything at all. Officer Bracken took the document from my hands, studied the date, glanced at me and then at Corinne, and something in his expression went very still and very official. He got on his radio and requested a second unit and a caseworker from Child Protective Services, and while we waited on that porch, Corinne would not stop talking, building her case out loud to the officer, to the neighbors now gathering on their own front steps, to the empty air itself, as if repeating it enough times would make it retroactively true. "I am the one protecting her," she said, "from a mother who nearly died in front of her and could do it again without warning. Iris deserves stability, and somewhere underneath all her denial, Josephine knows that." Nathaniel had gone quiet beside her, staring at the porch floorboards, unwilling to meet my eyes or hers. The caseworker arrived within the hour, a woman named Miss Aldridge, small and composed, with the flat, unshockable calm of someone who had spent a career watching families produce every possible version of denial. She asked to see the folder, flipped through it with quick, practiced attention, and then looked up at Corinne with a single sharp question. "You listed yourself as this child's mother on a hospital intake form," she said. "Under what legal authority did you believe that was accurate?" Corinne's composure flickered for the first time, and she said something about a well-meaning receptionist misunderstanding her, a detail Ms. Aldridge noted in a small spiral notebook without any visible reaction at all. Ms. Aldridge asked where the authorization had been notarized, and Corinne answered readily, naming a small notary office 2 towns over run by a man named Palmer, an old family friend who'd done it as a favor without charging a fee. Ms. Aldridge's expression didn't change, but she took out her phone immediately, and within a few minutes she confirmed what her instinct had apparently already told her, that Palmer's notary commission had been suspended 11 months earlier following a state investigation into a pattern of improperly witnessed guardianship documents, an investigation that was, at that very moment, still active. The color drained from Corinne's face the way water leaves a sink, and for the first time since I'd arrived on that porch, she had nothing prepared to say. Ms. Aldridge photographed every page of the folder methodically, narrating the date and location into a small recorder as she worked, and told Officer Bracken to document Corinne's statements word for word, because every sentence she'd said about earning the right to keep my daughter was, in the caseworker's careful language, potential evidence rather than idle conversation. She then turned to me and lowered her voice so only I could hear it, explaining that using a forged authorization to refuse the return of a child to a fit parent could rise, depending on how the district attorney chose to interpret it, to the level of attempted custodial interference, a phrase that landed in my chest like something solid enough to finally stand on. Miss Aldridge walked past Corinne into the house, and I followed on legs that still hadn't fully forgiven me for the stroke, into a living room I barely recognized, rebuilt entirely around an infant who wasn't hers, A new bassinet sat by the window. A shelf held stuffed animals I'd never bought. And on the mantel, replacing a framed photo I dimly remembered of Rowan's son Miles as a toddler, sat a large studio portrait of Corinne holding Iris, both of them dressed in matching cream-colored outfits, professionally lit and framed like the centerpiece of a family that had already decided to write me out of it. Iris was asleep in a portable crib in the corner, and when I picked her up, her whole body startled awake and then, after a long, searching pause, settled against me in a way that made something in my chest finally break open. Ms. Alderidge told me gently that she needed to conduct a standard assessment of the home and Corinne's account, and that because Iris was preverbal, the investigation would rely heavily on documentation rather than testimony, a distinction I hadn't considered until she said it plainly. There would be no 5-year-old to describe a secret whispered at bedtime. There would only be paper trails, timestamps, and the physical evidence of a life quietly being rebuilt around a child who belonged to someone else. She asked whether our house had a baby monitor system, and when I said yes, an app-based one that stored footage remotely, her eyes sharpened with the particular interest of someone who'd just found a lead she hadn't expected. I hired a family law attorney named Emery Talbot 2 days later, a woman in her 50s with a reputation, according to a coworker who'd used her during her own custody dispute, for treating every case like a personal insult against fairness itself. Her office was modest, tucked above a dry cleaner, and she listened to my entire account without interrupting once, occasionally underlining a date or a name so hard the pen nearly tore the paper. When I finished, she told me the forged authorization, the thing Corinne clearly believed was her strongest weapon, was in fact the single most damaging piece of evidence in the entire case, because it transformed the story from a grandmother who got attached under pressure into a woman who had committed a calculated, documented crime. Emery subpoenaed the baby monitor footage from our house's cloud storage, and what came back over the following days turned my stomach in ways the porch confrontation hadn't managed to. In one clip, timestamped 6 weeks into my coma, Corinne stood over the crib whispering to Iris that, "Mommy might not come back the same, but I will always, always be here." A sentence that sounded tender out of context and chilling once you understood what she'd already been planning. In another, timestamped just 2 weeks after Iris was born, Corinne could be heard on a phone call telling someone, presumably a friend, that this might finally be my second chance, the way Miles should have been, a line Emery read aloud twice to make sure she'd heard it correctly. Emery connected me with a forensic financial investigator named Priyansh Kapadia, who traced Corinne's purchases and found something that made the whole timeline collapse into a shape none of us wanted to see. Corinne had bought a nursery-grade crib, a car seat, and a stack of school enrollment inquiry forms nearly 7 weeks before Iris was even born, well before my delivery, well before any medical emergency existed at all. She had also, 6 months prior, searched online for terms including grandparent guardianship rights when parent incapacitated, how to legally obtain custody from unfit new mother, and, most disturbing of all, postpartum stroke recovery odds, language suggesting she had been researching the exact medical risk that eventually put me in a coma, long before I ever went into labor. I sat with Priyansh's report longer than I wanted to, understanding that the woman I'd called family, the woman who'd hugged me at my wedding and cried happy tears at my baby shower, had been quietly preparing to take my daughter from the moment she learned I was pregnant, waiting only for the right kind of crisis to make her theft look like heroism. Emery told me gently that this pattern, methodical preparation stretching back months before any emergency, made premeditation almost impossible for a defense attorney to argue away, and that a woman who buys a crib 7 weeks before a baby's birth is not a relative caught off guard by a sudden tragedy. Around that same time, Nathaniel's brother Rowan called me, his voice tight with something between guilt and disbelief, saying he'd finally reached out to his ex-wife Adeline after 6 years of silence to ask her, honestly, what had actually happened with Miles all those years ago. Adeline told him in a long and exhausted phone call he then relayed to me almost word for word, that Corinne had done nearly the exact same thing during a difficult stretch of Rowan and Adeline's marriage, inserting herself as Miles's primary caregiver during a period when Adeline was hospitalized for postpartum depression, telling neighbors and Miles's daycare that she was his real mother for now, and refusing to fully return him even after Adeline recovered, until Adeline finally moved across the state specifically to put distance between her son and his grandmother. That call gave Emery something even more powerful than the search history and the forged form, a documented pattern stretching back 6 years, a second family who had lived through an earlier version of exactly what I was living through now. Adeline agreed, after some hesitation, to provide a written statement and eventually to testify, saying she'd stayed silent for years, partly out of exhaustion, and partly because nobody in the family had ever believed her the first time, and she wasn't going to let that same silence protect Corinne through a second child. The criminal case moved forward on a parallel track to the custody fight, and a prosecutor named Miss Whitcomb took over on behalf of the state, methodical and unhurried in a way that made me trust her almost instantly. She explained that the forged authorization alone constituted a felony, but that combined with the premeditated purchases, the search history, and Adeline's account of a nearly identical pattern with Miles, the case had shifted from an isolated incident into something resembling a demonstrated method, the kind of pattern prosecutors love because juries find it almost impossible to dismiss as a misunderstanding. Miss Whitcomb offered Corinne a plea deal, probation with mandatory psychological treatment, and a permanent admission of guilt entered into the record. And Emery told me privately that accepting it would spare Iris and me the ordeal of a public trial while still delivering real, documented consequences. I told her I'd accept it if Corinne did, mostly to protect my daughter from a courtroom circus over her infancy, but 3 days later Emery called back with something close to disbelief in her voice. Corinne had rejected the deal outright, insisting on trial, apparently still convinced that 12 strangers would look at everything she'd done and see nothing but a devoted grandmother wronged by an ungrateful daughter-in-law. The custody hearing came first, scheduled on an expedited docket because of the forged document and the caseworker's report. I stood in that courtroom 11 days after my discharge, still weak, still terrified my own body might betray me in front of a judge deciding whether I got to keep my daughter. Corinne arrived composed, dressed in a soft gray cardigan that made her look every bit the harmless grandmother her lawyer wanted the room to see, and she did not once look in my direction. Her attorney argued that Corinne had acted selflessly during an unthinkable crisis, that any documentation irregularities were the innocent mistakes of a grieving, overwhelmed relative, and that severing her bond with Iris now would traumatize an infant who had known no other caregiver for nearly a quarter of her short life. Emery stood and dismantled that argument piece by piece, laying the search history in front of the judge first, then the crib purchased 7 weeks before Iris's birth, then the forged authorization dated to a day I was clinically unconscious, then Adeline's sworn statement describing an almost identical pattern with Miles 6 years earlier. "This is not a woman who panicked," Emery said. "This is a woman who has run this exact plan before, refined it, and executed it a second time the moment circumstances allowed." The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and very little patience for theatrics, read every document in silence before setting it down and ruling, effective immediately, that Iris would remain in my sole custody, with a follow-up evaluation ordered to assess any attachment disruption the child might have experienced. That evaluation came from a pediatric attachment specialist named Dr. Miriam Solberg, who spent 2 sessions observing Iris with me and, separately, reviewing the caregiving footage Emery had already obtained. She told the court that infants Iris's age were remarkably capable of re-establishing primary attachment quickly given consistent, responsive care, but that the household environment Corinne had built, including the studio portrait replacing another child's photograph on the mantle and the social media persona presenting herself as Iris's real mom, reflected a pattern research associates with what she called substitutive parenting, an adult reassigning a child's identity to fill a loss that child had nothing to do with. Her written opinion recommended no unsupervised contact between Corinne and Iris going forward. 2 weeks after the custody ruling, Corinne mailed a padded envelope addressed to Iris at our house, no return address, containing a small stuffed rabbit and a card that read, in handwriting I recognized instantly, that Grandma's baby would come home again soon, and that some bonds could never truly be broken no matter what a courtroom said. I didn't open it myself, following Emery's instructions exactly, photographing it sealed and delivering it straight to her office, where it became, in Emery's words, a defendant handing us evidence of continued intent in her own handwriting, while out on bail. Emery filed for a restraining order the same afternoon, and it was granted within days, barring Corinne from any contact with Iris and from coming within 500 feet of our home, my workplace, or Iris's daycare. The trial began on an overcast morning nearly 5 months after I'd woken from my coma, and Corinne sat at the defense table in the same soft gray cardigan, composed and unreadable, as Miss Whitcomb laid out the case in careful chronological order. She put the forged authorization on the courtroom monitor beside my hospital records showing the exact date I'd been sedated, letting the jury absorb the impossibility side by side without needing to say much at all. She played the baby monitor audio of Corinne whispering about my second chance, and I watched 2 jurors exchange a glance that told me the recording had landed exactly the way Miss Whitcomb intended it to. Adeline testified on the second day, her voice steady despite the 6 years of silence behind it. describing how Corinne had inserted herself as Miles's caregiver during her own postpartum crisis, how she'd had to move across the state to finally stop the pattern from repeating, how she'd stayed quiet for years out of sheer exhaustion until Rowan finally asked her the question nobody in the family had thought to ask sooner. Watching Corinne's face during that testimony, I saw something crack that hadn't cracked on the porch or in the custody courtroom, a flicker of real fear finally breaking through the composure she'd maintained through every previous confrontation. Nathaniel testified on the third day, thinner than I'd ever seen him, his voice barely carrying to the back of the room as he described the slow months of absorbing his mother's version of events, the moments he'd noticed something wrong and talked himself out of acting on it, the phone call he'd overheard where his mother told a friend Iris might be her second chance before I'd even woken from my coma. He said he would carry for the rest of his life the guilt of standing in a doorway looking at the floor while his mother refused to return his daughter to his wife, and hearing him say it out loud, in front of a room full of strangers, was the first time I felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched tight since the night I woke up asking for Iris. The jury deliberated for just under 5 hours before returning guilty verdicts on charges of forgery, attempted custodial interference, and fraud related to the notarized document, and I sat in the gallery next to Emery feeling something quieter than triumph, a flat, exhausted relief that didn't erase the 3 months I'd lost or the months of rebuilding still ahead of us. At sentencing, the judge looked directly at Corinne and told her that her grief over Miles may have been real, but that grief did not grant her license to forge a mother's name or manufacture a second theft using the same blueprint as the first, sentencing her to probation, mandatory psychiatric treatment, and a permanent restraining order that would remain active until Iris turned 18. I moved through the following months slowly, rebuilding routines with Iris that felt fragile at first and steadier with each passing week, feeding her at the same times every day, holding her through the nights when my own body still ached from a recovery that hadn't fully finished. Dr. Solberg's follow-up assessments showed exactly what she'd predicted, a strong and quickly re-established bond between us, no lasting attachment confusion visible in an infant too young to have absorbed the story the way an older child might have. Adeline and I started talking regularly, two women who'd survived versions of the same theft 6 years apart, comparing notes on a family member neither of us had ever imagined capable of what she'd done,